everybody. It is time for the Weekend Interview Show. I'm your host, Philip Drew, Administrator. And back in November, I interviewed Nebojsa Malic. He writes the Balkan Express column on antiwar.com. And we ran out of time. We had an hour to talk about 100,000 hours worth of discussion time, worth of material there. So I invited him back on the air today so we can help flesh out some of the story of the breakup of the former Yugoslavia and all the wars that go on there and American involvement in that mess, and especially the war in Kosovo in 1999. And so welcome back to the show, Nebojsa.
Thank you, Philip. It's good to be back.
All right. So I guess where we left off was Serbia and the war against Serbia to quote-unquote liberate Kosovo. And so I guess my first question ought to be, why did the West choose the Serbs to be the bad guy? I mean, the situation that you described to me was a bunch of ethnic collectivists all fighting with each other and seceding from each other and massacring each other. And yet somehow to the United States and to the so-called European community and everything, the Serbs were the bad guys. Milosevic was the worst of all the bad guys and became the target. Can you explain to me why it turned out that way?
Well, I'm not really sure it's quite clear to the present day. There's, of course, several hypotheses, and they're all very plausible. One of them is that in the early 1990s, most politicians in the West could not really comprehend that the Cold War really was over, and that communism has lost, and that communism was on its way out. Milosevic at the time, and he has never actually renounced his former policies as a communist. He came into power as a communist, and he just renamed his party into the Socialist Union, or actually the Socialist Party. So I guess he was seen as the leftover of communism, and therefore targeted. Another part of it could have been also that of all the republics of the former Yugoslavia that were splitting up left and right, Serbia was the only one, Serbia and Montenegro at the time were the only ones not pledging allegiance to the West. They were not promising alliances and obedience. For example, Slovenia, which seceded first, immediately pledged public support for Germany and Austria. And basically, every one of these leaders had a sponsor from the outside, and most of them had sponsors in the West. They said, okay, we will be your obedient vassals if you help us gain independence, which wasn't much of an independence in that case, but to them it didn't matter because they would get to be in charge. Izetbegovic in Bosnia did a similar thing, except that he lobbied at the same time both the Islamic world as well as the West, whereas Serbia didn't really lobby anybody. I'm not really sure why or how, but they simply didn't. And Milosevic's leadership thought they had some historical alliances or historical friendships at the very least with Moscow and maybe Beijing, but none of that has ever proven to be anything but wishful thinking. So I think it could be said that part of the reason that the Serbs were designated culprit was that, they were there, and they had a former communist leadership that never quite renounced their communism. And, of course, Serbs were a factor in the conflicts in Croatia as well as in Bosnia, and because of the very skillful PR campaigns here, the world was convinced that this was an invasion from within Serbia as opposed to conflicts over territories inhabited by ethnic Serbs, territories that were claimed by the states of Croatia and Bosnia. So there's numerous factors, but it sort of coalesced into a general impression that was very hard to shake and still is.
So during this time that all the different ethnic populations were being pushed here and there, and all these warring factions were fighting over territory, I guess ethnic cleansing was the euphemism that they used in the news at the time. Were the Serbs any worse than the other factions? I mean, as far as massacres and ethnic cleansing and removals of people, did they act any different than other groups did?
Well, they're certainly accused of being. I would say, I don't know. I mean, there's plenty of numbers to support either contention. General impression is that the Serbs did all the ethnic cleansing and nobody else did any. Whereas if you look at the numbers of sheer millions of refugees, you'll find that there's as many Serbs or even more as the Croats and Muslims put together in Bosnia and Croatia, respectively. So it's really hard to say. I guess it depends on which particular moment in time you're looking at, I suppose. And if you're looking at 1992, then yes, probably most of the ethnic cleansing was perpetrated by Serbs at that point in time. If you're looking at, for example, 95, then the picture is significantly different.
Yeah, and I know for a fact that when you look at 2000 and 2001, it's the Serbs being all pushed out of Kosovo. Precisely.
And yeah, I'm not even talking about Kosovo at this point, but yes, what happened in Kosovo was a I prefer to refer to the period between 91 and 95 as the wars of succession, because those were the wars between not wars for independence so much as wars for territory, between republics that seceded from Yugoslavia and then claimed succession rights. Whereas Kosovo was a different bag of chips altogether. Kosovo was a attempt at not so much secession of a polity as in a actual state or province, as much as an attempt to establish an ethnically clean territory, which would be first separated as an independent state, and then would either be annexed to Albania proper, or would actually annex Albania to it. So that was definitely an international issue as opposed to an inter-Yugoslav issue of the early 1990s.
Okay, well, the PR on TV says that Clinton's big failure was that he didn't intervene back during 95 and before, or 93, I guess, especially. Mm-hmm. But then by 1999, he redeemed himself by going in and stopping what was going on in Kosovo. But it sounds really like, well, not that he was starting, but that he was finishing what was going on in Kosovo rather than stopping it.
Pretty much so. I mean, you have to pay attention to what has been written in the media, in the press, and told in the media in the 1980s, as well as the 1990s. There's plenty of resources out on the web. I couldn't actually rattle off the URLs off the top of my head, but look for pieces written about the former Yugoslavia in the 1980s, from 1982, 83 onwards to maybe 1987 even, and you will find that one of the burning problems in that country at the time, before it even started breaking up, was the issue of Albanian separatism in Kosovo. It's an issue of a population that has pretty much always been present in the area, but has never been a majority until the 20th century, and has gained that status through mass immigration, incredibly high birth rates, which were either product of social engineering or coercion on part of ethnic leaders, and outright violence, massive expulsions of people and seizure of their property. It was the vilest form of demographic warfare on all three fronts, that is, between expulsions, immigration, and birth rates, that literally changed the ethnic picture of Kosovo within a century. And there is a continuity in it, reaching as far back as the time of the Turkish occupation, as early as maybe 16th century, when a lot of Albanians who used to be Christians before the Ottomans came, they converted to Islam and were given privileges over Christians who stayed in the area, as was the custom of Muslim empires who ruled Christians and Jews and others. And these people were then subsequently used as a hammer against the local Christians who rebelled repeatedly against Turkish authority. And in fact, those Serbs that ended up in areas of Croatia that were contested in the 1990s, they were originally from Kosovo. They were chased out by Turks. They chose to flee because life was unbearable They moved in massive numbers, 30, 40, 50,000 of them at any given time, at least twice in the 17th century alone. So here you have a situation where the Albanians and the Serbs are at each other's throats in Kosovo because of the Ottoman occupation. And then in the 19th century, when Central Serbia declares independence and is given independence by the Ottomans as a result of a couple of wars, Kosovo, the repression in Kosovo gets even harsher. And it continues up to the 1870s when the Austrians move into the area with their plans of conquering the Balkans and replacing the Turks as the overlord. And then they encourage the Albanians because Serbia is their chief enemy. Serbia is the independent country that does not take orders from them. And so they go in and they support Albanian movements for ethnic cleansing of Kosovo and territorial claims, and they were instrumental in the creation of the state of Albania in 1912. And in as much as the state of Albania, or at least an Albanian homeland, is definitely a worthwhile goal, part of the Austrians' motivation had nothing to do with the Albanians. It had everything to do with denying Serbian access to the sea. So you have to look at this through the lens of great power politics.
Well, and I start wondering here, what's North America going to do about this? I mean, I don't think
North America, or specifically Washington, has any real understanding of what's going on there. I don't think most Americans care, except to show outrage at what they're being served in the media. But what they're being served in the media is maybe a sliver of reality that doesn't even correspond to most of it. Has there been any mention in the American media of over 120 churches alone that have been dynamited and desecrated over the past 4 years? I haven't seen any.
Only on your column, as far as
yeah, well, now that you mention it.
Yeah, links to foreign press.
Exactly. I mean, there's very little. Yes, it is mentioned in passing, and these churches are all. It's always a church has been blown up. Well, by whom? The Tooth Fairy? I mean, somebody had to come in and do it, but no perpetrators were ever caught. Nobody was ever put on trial. Nobody cares.
So, what does the empire even want with that area? I mean, is this all just about ports and oil fields, or I mean, what the hell is? Why should America even be involved over there at all? I'm far too cynical to believe that any policymakers in America really care about human rights or protecting innocent people or anything like that. So what's their interest there?
Well, that's a good question. First of all, to answer, America should not be there. Secondly, there's been some speculation about some oil fields and pipelines. The pipelines specifically that are coming through Macedonia and Albania. But my impression is it was a combination of relying on Albania as a strategic ally in the region, as a place that again, in exchange for money and aid, offered the U.S. Absolute access to all of its territory, military bases, and so on and so forth. Basically offered itself up as a loyal vassal. And part of the deal was that the U.S. would help out the cause of the ethnic Albanians in Kosovo. On the other hand, you have a situation where the U.S. is now going actively, even after the Dayton Agreement, after 1995, is going after Slobodan Milosevic because they don't want him in Serbia. They don't want him in power. They want in power somebody who's more pliable to their, shall I say, guidance, more compliant with their desires. And Milosevic is not it. Milosevic wants to talk as equals, but the empire has no equals. It only has servants. It only has victims. So he didn't want to be a servant, for better or worse. So the insurgency in Kosovo, the KLA, which appears at first in 1996 and then goes on through 1999 and beyond, clearly a terrorist organization. I mean, even one of the U.S. diplomats admitted this, and he was basically immediately sent over to Indonesia to atone for his sins of speaking too honestly. The KLA was funded first through German intelligence agencies and then through the CIA and all sorts of U.S. black ops as a way to destabilize Milosevic. The idea was the U.S. is going to kill two birds with one stone. It's going to help the Albanians and earn more of their gratitude and support, which in a way it has, although the quality of it is dubious. And it's also going to force Milosevic out of power by taking away Kosovo, which is Serbian heartland, It's very important to their religious and cultural heritage. By taking away Kosovo, they're going to basically paint Milosevic in a corner from which he can no longer win an election, which in a way proved semi-accurate a couple, 2 years later. So really it was just an attempt at political manipulation. The war was fought specifically to topple the government in Belgrade and to get some brownie points with the Albanian people.
Well, and now I have this problem with the whole enemy of my enemy is my friend, because now we have these KLA terrorist guys who, I mean, are basically the eastern outpost in the West, and they're tied in with, to some degree at least, from what I've read, different terrorist groups around the Middle East, perhaps even Al-Qaeda, running drugs, provoking violence and uprisings in neighboring Macedonia and all this. And so, you know, in order to kill two birds with one stone, we've created another bird that we got to find a way to kill now later on, at least.
Exactly. I've heard that as well, and I've heard it from many sources that there are certainly links between Kosovo Albanian terrorists, the KLA, and other KLA offshoots, and Al Qaeda. Now, I'm a little wary in that respect, because while certainly there are parts of the KLA that are part of the international terrorist infrastructure, we also have to keep in mind that most of the KLA isn't really fighting a holy war on behalf of Islam. They're fighting a holy war on behalf of the Albanian nation. These people are nationalists, very, very passionately so, in a sense of kill everybody who's not one of us. So I suppose they're in a sense worse than the Islamic fundamentalists, because they at least allow the existence of others, even though they don't really give them any rights. These guys are very much racial exclusivists. So their cause is nationalism, is violent, chauvinistic nationalism, and I would dare say even genocidal in the sense of what they've done in Kosovo, and what they've attempted to do in Macedonia, and what they might even attempt to do in Montenegro and northern Greece tomorrow. These guys have designs on a certain territory. They've even published maps of it, and they talk about it fairly openly. Of course, for public consumption, they cloak it in the language of human rights and minority rights, democracy and freedom and so on and so forth, but it has nothing to do with any of it. And yes, they are. Some of them are part of the international terrorist infrastructure. There's an extreme amount of heroin smuggling going on. They're the main supplier of heroin to the European market. There's a lot of sex slave trade, reaching as far as Britain.
With plenty of UN involvement in that.
Yeah, the UN is definitely providing customers for the sex slave trade, given that Kosovo is not necessarily a zone where people want to bring their families in. You have anywhere from 15 to 30,000 people who, have no outlets for their desires, to put it euphemistically. And obviously they're going to be customers for sex slaves and prostitutes of that kind. Same case has been seen in Bosnia. There's been an explosion of prostitution once the UN and later NATO troops came in. It's the law of supply and demand, however disgusting that particular instance may be.
So what exactly... Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, the UN's specific involvement in this count is that they are basically they're paying this outfit called the Kosovo Protection Corps, which is protecting people from their lives and property, I suppose, which is composed almost exclusively of KLA members, not even former KLA members, but actually, people who never renounced their membership in the KLA, who drive around in UN-funded vehicles with UN-funded sidearms and terrorize population openly.
What is the legal status of Kosovo at this point? Because, basically Serbia could kiss Kosovo goodbye if to what degree have the Serbs been pushed out of Kosovo, I guess, is the first question. And then secondly, what is the status of the Kosovo state? Is it just going to become part of Albania? Or?
Well, let me answer the first question first. Legally, at this point, if we rely on UN Resolution 1244, which I don't know why we should, but let's say for the sake of international law, Kosovo is technically still a part of Serbia. It is a province of Serbia, and there's nothing in international law that specifies any circumstances under which a piece of territory can be legitimately detached from another state by force. So Kosovo is technically still a part of Serbia. What is being pushed consistently and gradually is a way for Kosovo to be separated from Serbia, and if the authorities in Belgrade are compliant enough, they will condone this separation in exchange for a promise of international aid or some such. Or maybe as a response to threats of indicting every single Serb for war crimes. On the other hand, what's happening in Kosovo right now as far as the position of Serbs and the possibilities of joining up with Albania, there's recently, I think as recently as 3 months ago, been a initiative of a party in Albania proper to consider to launch a dialogue on the unification of all Albanian lands, and it has met with enthusiastic support of all parties on the Albanian as well as Kosovo and Macedonian political spectrum, and I'm talking about Albanian parties at this point. It is obvious that there are definitely plans to create an Albanian state that would encompass Kosovo as well as Albania and certain other territories in Serbia and Macedonia and again Montenegro and maybe northern Greece, although Greece might be a tough nut to crack for being a member of NATO and all. But it's very unclear, and I'm suspecting that the Kosovo Albanians would have the final word in that particular union, that they are the most militant ones of the entire bunch, and they would tend to aspire to leadership positions in such a state, which is not necessarily going down very well with a lot of people in Albania proper. However nationalist they may be, they still like their government jobs and positions of power. So that's a very interesting question, and we'll have to see how it develops, if it ever develops, and I hope it doesn't. On the other hand, there's very few Serbs left in Kosovo. Estimates range around 100,000. I think it's a little less. They live in enclaves, completely separated from any sort of source of income. They have a little bit of land, which if they try to work, they get killed. They basically live in concentration camps under NATO's protection, and the greatest irony is that NATO, without which Kosovo's occupation would not have been possible, is now protecting the people who are the principal victims of that occupation.
Sounds like it's all upside down.
Oh, absolutely. The world is completely upside down. There's, in Kosovo at least, everything that's, black is white, short is long, everything is wrong.
This is Radio Chaos 95.9 FM, the weekend interview show. I'm Phil Drew. The guest is Nebojsa Malic. He writes the column Balkan Express at antiwar.com. Let's see here. You wrote in your column that there were elections coming up. Did those already happen?
In Serbia, yes, they did happen today.
Oh, okay, so we don't know who won yet or anything.
Some exit polls are indicating that the Radical Party may have won the most votes, but not enough of a majority to form a government. That's what I've heard in the past, right before the show started. So that's the latest I hear.
Right. In the land of 15 governments, right?
Yeah, well, that's Bosnia actually, but in Serbia it might be just as bad. They've been ruled by a motley coalition of parties that have never actually won any sort of popular vote on their own merit. And now that coalition is fractured and their leaders are being sort of punished for corruption and mismanagement, but a lot of people voted for them out of fear of the radicals, because the radicals are really a bunch of people who they have one or two good ideas for all the wrong reasons, and that they're not motivated by any sort of principled defense of life, liberty, or property. They're just, things that sound good, such as freedom in the sense of international community and independence. But they're wanting to use them to expand their political base and their political power, and their program is very statist, very, I won't say socialist, but maybe nationalist socialist. And they're immensely popular for that very reason, that the government is unpopular. And people are mostly protest vote thing, which again goes to show that democracy is just a very unpredictable and flawed solution. But what can you do? Everybody in the West, especially in Washington, but as well in Europe and certainly in the media, is horrified of a prospect of a radical government. Not only will they not be taking orders from the West, they will actually be actively defying everything. And they're threatening new sanctions and withholding aid and withholding loans and maybe new blockades. They're doing everything in their power to threaten the Serbs into not voting for the radicals.
That's how we go and liberate people and guarantee them democracy.
No, absolutely. The democracy, who was it that said that the people have, I think it was one of the leaders of East Germany that said, well, the people have spoken, they voted, I think we need a new people.
Yeah, that sounds like the motto of the statist.
Indeed. Indeed.
Oh, man. All right, well, let's rewind a little bit. I want to talk a little bit more about America's airstrike campaign in 1999.
Yes.
We discussed last time about how Madeleine Albright brought everybody to the table, and everybody winked at each other that we're all going to sign this, and the Serbs will be the ones stuck out who can't sign it. And so then we'll use that as the pretext to bomb them. And I remember at the time it was expected that they were going to capitulate after a couple of days, and yet they hung on, and the bombing campaign went on for months and months. And there's footage every day of refugees, and there were claims, at least, of mass graves everywhere. And I don't know, I guess what I'd like you to flesh out for me, there were some reports that I had heard that the photo or the footage of the refugees, that a lot of times it was the same refugees over and over, and they were just being told to go back around the hill and come back again for the cameras and stuff, and that the mass graves didn't even exist, that when they went and looked at the places where the mass graves of all these civilians supposedly were, that they weren't even there at all. Is that right?
Well, I can certainly shed some light on that, I believe. Let's start from the top. The ultimatum at Rambouillet was compared in many sources, but not in the mainstream media, to the Austro-Hungarian ultimatum of 1914, which precipitated World War I. It was designed to be refused. It was designed to be rejected by Serbian government, which it was. And at this point, Milosevic, who had worked with Americans in Dayton, who basically, if you read Richard Holbrooke's book, which, again, I wouldn't recommend because I don't want to give Holbrooke any money, but it is truly an invaluable source to see how things were happening. He literally saved that negotiation from failure. And he did so even though Holbrooke tried to cheat him out of the agreed terms, which Holbrooke himself admits freely. And is actually pretty proud of it. So here we have Holbrooke again coming to Milosevic in 98 and 99 trying to broker some sort of solution for Kosovo, and Milosevic is saying, why should I trust you? I mean, you've tried to cheat me once, you've cheated me twice already, because when the observer mission came in 98 and early 99, the KLA, which was defeated at that point, came back with a vengeance and started attacking Serbian civilians and police again. And the observers were basically acting as their shields. So here we have a situation where Milosevic refused to deal with the West because he's been deceived so many times that he couldn't trust them anymore. And obviously, he figured that they wouldn't dare to bomb in such a flagrant violation of international law. This was a clear, naked aggression that he figured they would have incredible trouble justifying to their people. And unfortunately, he was wrong on the count that they really didn't care what their people thought, or at least managed to deceive the people with such simple lies. And they literally were fabrications, just blatant fabrications. For example, there was a claim that over 100,000 people were executed, which is an absolute lie. There was a claim of a concentration camp in the Pristina soccer stadium, which was an absolute lie. There were even claims that persisted to the present day of 10,000 people killed, executed, ethnically cleansed, genocide. And yet, none of these people have turned up. All the famous mass graves that were supposedly discovered amounted to maybe 3,000 people altogether, and it was impossible to establish who clearly, or at least they didn't say they wanted to, who were civilians and how did they die. So, for all we know, the official Serbian government claimed that most of these people died as a result of NATO bombing might be the absolute truth, because nobody's telling. And I'm thinking, if they had actual evidence that these people were executed at close range, don't you think it would have been all over the papers by now? It's been 4 years.
Sure,
so obviously, yeah.
Tell a wound like that.
Well, exactly. So there's definitely stuff to hide. I wouldn't be surprised if the refugees were turned around a couple of times for the sake of the cameras and ordered to give command performances, because there were reports, it mentioned in several news reports at the time, that the refugees were coordinated by young men in black uniforms wearing the KLA patches. So obviously the KLA had a huge hand in coordinating refugee movements. I wouldn't go as far as to suggest that all of the refugees who crossed into Macedonia or Montenegro were basically told by the KLA, leave or else. But a significant number of them may have been, and there are reports by non-Serbs who lived in Pristina, and notably the head of the Jewish community in Pristina, who was after the war expelled by the Albanians, that there were little posters and flyers and leaflets all over the place when the bombing started, a couple of weeks after the bombing started, therefore after that period in which they thought Milosevic was going to surrender, instructing the people to leave, instructing the people to just pick up their stuff, pack a bag, and leave Kosovo or face death at the hands of the KLA. Or, they were told, well, leave or the Serbs will kill you, but either way, there are indications that the KLA has organized, at least for part of the exodus, in order to create some sort of propaganda background for the war, and I'm convinced that the U.S. government not only knew about it, but wanted it to happen. And so you have a situation in which there are deliberately placed misinformation about mass graves and casualties, and you have a situation in which refugees are being pouring over the border with all sorts of incredible stories that are taken 100% at face value in presence of KLA-supplied interpreters, and by the media that are basically carrying the official line from Brussels, from the NATO headquarters, because to do otherwise would be to be denied access. And you have a situation in which basically the entire information effort of the Western media is crass propaganda.
Well, I remember the just absolutely shocked look on the face of Judy Woodruff from CNN when she hosted the town hall meeting where William Perry and Madeleine Albright and I'm trying to forget, somebody else went and had a big town hall meeting somewhere in the Midwest. And
I believe so, yes, I think I remember.
Came to the microphone and said, you guys are murderers, how dare you, this is crazy, this is wrong. They had no supporters whatsoever. The entire crowd turned on them. And CNN, who was Bernard Shaw and Judy Woodruff hosting the thing, they just didn't know what to do. How dare these American people contradict their executive branch leaders here to tell them how it is?
Exactly. How dare these people think thoughts that we have not given them permission to? And that has been the case. There's been a lot of sentiment in the U.S. against the Kosovo War, and every time that the outrage grew, there would be another story of an atrocity. There would be another story of mass rape or genocide or massacres or people being thrown into the mine shafts. Speaking of which, let me tell you about that. That story about over 200 or 2,000 or 15,000 bodies dumped into the mine shafts in one of the mines in northern Kosovo, that story has been repeated for ages, and most recently by Minnesota Public Radio. I think it was last year. That story was debunked in 2000 by no other than Daniel Pearl, the Wall Street Journal journalist who got killed in Pakistan.
He was a great debunker, wasn't he? He was the
yes, he really was.
He was the guy who, I believe for the Wall Street Journal, debunked the story about the chemical weapons factory that Clinton bombed in Sudan.
Yep, I think that was him.
Yeah, that was one great reporter. No wonder he's dead.
Yeah, really. I'm beginning to suspect that some other people may have had a hand in this death besides the folks that we've been let know about.
It's kind of funny sometimes when the mass media don't check on which of the lies have been debunked and that they shouldn't proceed with. You know how Cheney kept insisting for 2 years after September 11th that Mohammed Atta met with the Iraqis in Prague. And
I remember that.
And it had been debunked for a year, and he repeated it again, and then it had been debunked for a second year, and then he repeated it again.
Well, that's the thing, though. It's the theory of the big lie. Hitler definitely didn't invent it, but he's the one who put it into words, I believe, or was it Goebbels? If you repeat something often enough, people will assume it's the truth, and nobody listens to denials. denials are only maybe quarter as effective as the actual initial information, which is why PR agencies who are employed by governments to spread propaganda in the West know their business. Their business is to get out the initial information. And by the time the initial information is debunked, it's very hard for people to turn around and admit that they've been lied to and deceived, and they simply continue on to their course or try to pretend to forget the entire thing because they will not admit to themselves, and not just the politicians, but regular people who've been duped, they will not admit to themselves that they've been deceived.
Yeah, they're much too smart for that, obviously.
Yeah.
Hey, I was watching Michael Moore's gun control movie not too long
ago. Oh, yes, the Bowling for Columbine?
Right. And there's one part where he points out that the day of the Columbine massacre, that was the day of the single biggest bombing of Serbia. And that he had bombed soccer fields and hospitals and trains and bridges, and we were raining cluster bombs on neighborhoods and going completely nuts on that same day with our Air Force. Yeah,
and that's very interesting, coming from Michael Moore.
The Democrats' war, after all, seems like he would have supported it.
Well, actually, he sort of does, and I'll tell you about that in a second. The cruel irony of it is that he was absolutely right on that particular count, that yes, it is the government-sponsored violence that incites people to commit acts of individual murder. I completely agree with this. Why would these people feel any qualm? Why would people in America or anywhere in a culture that approves of government-sponsored violence have any qualms about committing murder on the individual level? I mean, that simply doesn't make sense. So obviously, yes, Clinton's eagerness to bomb and kill certainly must have filtered down to his subjects. But see, a couple of I think it may have been earlier in November or even late in October, and I think I mentioned it in my column called Citizen Clark, dealing with Wesley Clark's nomination for Democratic candidacy for president, that one of the people who came out to support Wesley Clark was Michael Moore.
Yeah, isn't that funny?
Yeah, well, I think it's incredibly funny and incredibly tragic. Here you have Michael Moore condemning, after a fashion, the Kosovo War, and yet applauding the man who fought it, and who has, by the way, Bill Clinton's absolute support on this matter. So, and on the matter of his candidacy. So I'm thinking, okay, some wires got crossed here.
Yeah, well, when you have so many wires like Michael Moore, sometimes they get a little confusing.
Yeah, well, statists generally tend to get tangled in their own web of hypocrisies and lies and confusion because they're really there is no underlying principle to their thinking but the power of the state.
It must be really hard to be a leftist.
I think, well, I should know. I used to be one 10 years ago. I'm not one anymore, thank goodness.
Oh, yeah. Well, and as long as we're on the subject of Wesley Clark, do you know the story of how he got fired from his job as Supreme Allied Commander of NATO? Apparently there was something going on within the higher-ups that he ended up leaving at the end of that, right?
Yes. Well, there was definitely tension between him and the Defense Secretary. The Defense Secretary, Cohen, he was, I believe, one of the Republicans who agreed to serve in the Clinton administration, whether as a token or as somebody, as a bureaucrat, I don't know. And Cohen and Clark could not stand each other. And Clark was always the policy-making general. He was definitely always overstepping his bounds. He brags about how he was instrumental in U.S. intervention, how he helped bring it about, how he fought for these causes. I'm thinking, isn't that treason? Wasn't he supposed to be defending the United States and its Constitution as opposed to running around the world bombing people? But anyway, what happened is that I think Clark may have definitely screwed up his own chances of success when he, towards the end of the war, he ordered the British general, I believe his name is Michael Jackson, of all names, to attack the Russians who had landed at Pristina airport. See, at the end of the war, the Russians had tried to had tried to maintain a presence in Kosovo as part of their deal with Belgrade, under which the war ended, under which the armistice was signed. Okay, you agree for an international presence, and we'll send some troops, and we'll guarantee the safety of your people. Well, that never really worked out because NATO immediately blocked the transfer of Russian troops, had Eastern European countries denied them the use of airspace, and so on and so forth. But the 200 or so Russian paratroopers who ended up at the Pristina airport, and they controlled the airport for the next 2 years, Clark ordered Jackson to shoot on them. He ordered Jackson to attack the Russians, and Jackson said, "Are you nuts? I'm not going to start World War III for you." And Washington ended up backing Jackson over Clark, and I think that was the point when Cohen said, "Okay, I want this guy out. I want him out. He's a lunatic. I want him gone." And there's been a couple of other things during the war: his way of management, his micromanagement of everything, of every strike, of every attack, of every bombing schedule. There's been instances of his whole idea about using 200,000 troops to cross non-existent roads from Albania to invade Serbia from the ground, and the use of Apache helicopters, which cost the lives of at least 4 pilots and at least 2 machines, and none of them were actually ever used in combat, according to what we've been told. And in order to the number of training accidents that occurred within those 78 days and not before or after, that leads me to believe they might have been combat casualties, really there's been plenty of things that Clark screwed up, not the least of which has been that the war lasted for 78 days instead of 7. And I think that for a list of those reasons, he was eventually sacked because of the pressure of the professional army officer corps as well as Secretary Cohen. And Clark has never, ever been popular with his colleagues or his subordinates. He's only been popular with his higher-ups because he was so good at sucking up to them. And there's plenty of literature out on the web and in books as well as elsewhere that indicates that he really is just a professional suck-up.
Well, and they even admitted that they bombed trains a couple of times. They said it was an accident, but there were some media...
That was a lie. I'm sorry, that was a blatant lie. That he did. Clark himself, I think, was saying, or it might have been a British major. He was whichever NATO officer was giving that particular briefing. They were showing a tape of the train, but the tape of the train was shown at several times the real-time speed. So it was basically shown in fast forward. And the audience, the journalists, and the world media were led to believe that the pilot fired 2 missiles, and he didn't understand that he was aiming at the train. He thought he was aiming at the bridge. But the train was clearly visible, and the train was not going very fast. And he saw the train, he knew what he was shooting at, he took the shot, he did it deliberately, and it was blatantly obvious to anybody who was seeing the tape at normal speed. But the tape was shown and fast forward, and it was meant to exonerate the pilot. Same thing happened with several of the refugee convoys. NATO targets refugee convoys of refugees that are not moving in the right direction. They bomb convoys that are moving in towards Serbia as opposed to towards Albania. And sooner or later, the Albanians get the message, okay, if we don't go south, they bomb us. It happened. There was a village that the refugee column moving north was staying at. The village was leveled. Dozens of people were incinerated. We don't even know the number to the present day. I think it was in the hundreds. And NATO just said, well, oops, we didn't know the refugees were there. Well, hello, these are the people who had a network of KLA observers in the field that coordinated with them through cell phones and satellite phones and knew exactly what was going on in the field at any given time. And yet the KLA somehow neglected to inform them that they were going to massacre several hundred of their own people? I don't think so. I think either the KLA wanted them to be bombed or simply, NATO decided to bomb them anyway to send a message to the Albanian people, do not go north. So, yeah, I mean, all of these accidents, purported accidents that they're claiming, sound very incongruous when compared to the fact that they brag all along about these precision bombs and precision weapons that can fly into a window of a bedroom and not kill anybody else. So how come that all of these people were butchered by accidents? I'm not buying it. I'm sorry. I'm not buying it. I'm not saying that the bombing was 100% accurate or 100% in every case deliberate. But I'm not buying the Chinese embassy excuse. I'm not buying the marketplace in Niš. I'm not buying the bus at Varvarin Bridge. In fact, that place was bombed twice in 15 minutes. The second plane came in and bombed the rescuer, so that definitely wasn't an accident. I'm not buying the train. I'm not buying the Croatia refugees. Neither me nor many other people out there. We're simply not buying into this. And, of course, nobody cares what we think because the situation on the ground is such as it is. Albanians run the KLA in specific. I've got nothing against Albanian people in general. The KLA is running rampant in Kosovo, and nobody feels like stopping them. So, obviously, I try to expose these things for what they are because I do believe the truth is important. But,
why do you think they bombed the Chinese embassy? What was that about, you think?
Well, there was talk that the Chinese were providing intelligence or diplomatic support. We never quite found out. But the fact is that everybody knew in Belgrade, as well as everybody had maps that specifically identified the Chinese embassy as such. And there was no way they could have hit it by accident. They put 3 cruise missiles through 3 specific windows, completely destroying the Chinese intelligence section and killing, I think, 3 or 4 people and injuring about a dozen others. They knew exactly what they were doing. It was a message to Beijing, do not interfere. And they claimed it was an accident. They apologized. They offered money. And they claimed that, the fault was of somebody in the CIA who had old maps. But I'm not buying it 1 second. It was deliberate.
What do you see for the future? Is there any reason to hope that things are going to get straightened out here? I mean, Bill Clinton promised that our troops would be home 8 years and 3 days ago.
That's true.
It looks like a bottomless pit in Central Europe to me here.
And that's true. Well, the thing is, American troops will have to leave the region sooner or later. They will not be able to stay there forever. Not with these many commitments in the Middle East and elsewhere. And unless the draft is resurrected, which I somehow don't see how the public would go for, not in this particular climate even. There simply won't be enough troops to go around for all these wars that the neocons want to fight. And I don't necessarily see Bush continuing deliberately the Clinton's policies in the Balkans. I think they've continued through a sort of inertia because nobody really wanted to change course. Nobody really cared enough to try to at least remedy some of the harm that the interference has done. And it's very hard to reverse policy after it's been going on for a little while. But I think sooner or later there will have to be a realization in Washington that supporting something that's artificial, supporting something that's based on violence and force, and that so blatantly goes against any semblance of law, international, domestic, or otherwise, is simply not sustainable. And they will have to get out of the area and basically let the Serbs and the Albanians work it out somehow. And I'm hoping they'll work it out peacefully, but a part of me suspects it will have to be worked out with a force of arms one way or another, and I'm not looking forward to it. But as for Balkans in general, I really think that what has happened over the past 10 years with the interventions and the maintenance of Bosnia by force and occupation of Kosovo and so on, I think this is an artificial state of affairs. This is the state of affairs that the communists had imposed, similar to, in principle, to what the communists had imposed in 1945 and thought would last forever. Well, it lasts until 1990. So 45 years later, all of these festering wounds just came open and resulted in another round of bloodshed. And until these issues are somehow resolved, and I'm not saying they should be resolved by the force of arms, but unless these issues are somehow resolved and there's a clear closure and basically sort of either an agreement or some sort of finalized solution. I won't say final solution because that phrase obviously has all sorts of connotations and that I don't approve of. But unless there's some sort of solution that is acceptable to people who live there, Serbs, Croats, Bosnian Muslims, Albanians, Macedonians, and so on and so forth, then this will always be a point of contention. There will always be fighting and always be war, and this is simply something that is deeply tragic. And I think this kind of intervention that seeks to impose solutions, regardless of what the people in the field think, or in favor of just one of the or two of the sides in the conflict is making things that much worse.
Yeah, we're supposed to be the light of liberty to the whole world and the vindicator only of our own. That's the way it's supposed to go.
Yeah, I remember. Was it Washington or was it Adams?
That's John Quincy Adams.
Right. He's the one who. That's the part of the speech where he says America does not need to go abroad in search of monsters to destroy.
Right. I think he was talking about war in Greece for independence from God knows what empire. And
that was the Ottoman Empire. Yeah. That was. I think it was the 1820s when that happened, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, I agree with him. It's the best leadership is always by example. If this country, I don't know if it's too late for that. I think it might be too late. I think there's a good deal of housekeeping to be done inside the United States before this country can be an example of anything decent in the world for a very long time to come. And you know, I'm very sorry I have to say that because I do love this country. I've lived here for quite some time now, and there's many great things about it that I really do love. But I think there's a good bit of housekeeping that needs to be done, and a lot of wrong things that need to be set right here before this country can really salvage its reputation as an international bully that it has gained in the 1990s in particular. Although there are some people who go back for at least 100 years to point out all sorts of examples, and this is certainly not something that if I were a red-blooded American, this is definitely something that I wouldn't be particularly proud of. I'm not saying, you know, this is an issue. This is not an issue for other countries in the world as well. But certainly none of them pretends to be the light of liberty and the light of the world and an example of what life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness should be. So, you know, if I hold America to a higher standard, it's only because it aspires to it.
Absolutely. And, you know, if we just called ourselves the light of liberty and we failed at that, you know, what do you expect? It's human beings. But when we go around forcing people to have liberty like us, and yet ours is botched and theirs is worse by the time we're done delivering it to them, that really makes it look bad.
Not only does it look bad, but it's actually, I would go as far as qualify it as evil. I mean, here we are forcing people to behave like us, and in doing so, we're forcing them to repeat all of our mistakes and all of our flaws that we haven't dealt with or haven't acknowledged or actually are proud of without knowing that they're flaws, and we're making these people's lives infinitely worse. And in doing that, we're actually spreading hate. We're not spreading peace. We're not spreading liberty. We're not spreading the idea of property rights or pursuit of happiness. We're literally spreading hatred throughout the world. When American troops come, everybody knows to get out of the way because however much America may be appreciated by people who are exposed to consumer culture, American troops are, you know, they're very well trained to do their job, but their job is to kill people and break things. Their job is not to make nice. And I've had plenty of encounters with U.S. soldiers that have all been very, very correct, but I would not want to be stopped at their checkpoint. This is not something that's a pleasant experience.
Well, and you know, apparently all the numbers say that everybody around the world loves America and loves our culture. It's just our government that they hate.
And I agree with that, and I think it's very important for these people to know the distinction between the people and the government. It's just too bad that in a lot of cases, they don't make that distinction at home as well.
Right.
You know,
when we brag that we're a democracy, then we're more responsible for our government than, say, you know, the average Iraqi wasn't responsible for Saddam Hussein. There wasn't much he could have done about it.
Exactly. And we at least technically can and definitely have an obligation to. Not about Saddam Hussein, I mean, but about our own government.
Right. All right, well, thank you very much for coming on the show. I want to say happy anniversary to Radio Chaos, 2 years. I'm very proud. We can also, anyone in the world can listen live at KAOS959.com. Our guest this hour has been Nebojsa Malic. He writes Balkan Express at antiwar.com. I want to thank you for coming back on the show and helping me and my audience understand this Balkan disaster that America has gotten herself into here. So thank
you very much, Philip, and happy anniversary.
And happy New Year to you, my friend.
Thank you. You as well.